I'm glad to welcome you again. This is the third event in the Critics Lecture Series, sponsored by the Department of Art Criticism and Writing. The first two distinguished speakers were Arthur Danto and Mira Shore, and we found both of them quite illuminating. And I am especially happy to have David Carrier here to address us tonight. David is not only a dear friend, but also a scholar whose work I admire deeply. I'll tell you a little about him. When David was an undergraduate at Columbia, majoring in philosophy, he took courses from Arthur Danto, among others. Arthur, at the time, wasn't like an art critic yet. He was teaching philosophy straight up. And actually, ultimately, Arthur directed David's thesis in theories of representation. And then after college, David, like Arthur before him, and I might add parenthetically, like me too, kind of drifted out of the field that he had earned his PhD in and began increasingly to pay attention to and then to write about art and art-related issues. And he now teaches in Cleveland, where he's the Champney Family Professor, which is an endowed chair that is divided between two schools, Case Western Reserve and the Cleveland Art Academy. And in the meantime, he's written quite a number of distinguished books, a book on Poussin and a book on Baudelaire's writings about art, and then two books that show especially how perfect he is for the context that this series provides. That is, he wrote a book called Principles of Writing Art History, or something very close to that, and another book on writing art criticism. And above all, his project, which is most fascinating and attractive to me, it's right up my alley, which he's about to tell us about, which he's been at work on for some time, is writing what he calls a world art history, something which indeed we need, and it's rather amazing we don't have it yet. And we'll soon find out what he means by that. So it's my pleasure to give you David Carrier.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'm going to read the paper, but before I get to the paper itself and the slides with it, it's about a 50-minute paper, I'd like to make a few introductory points that are a little more informal. When I was a graduate student, the new book in aesthetics that was important in philosophy was by one of my teachers, Richard Volheim. It was called Art and Its Objects. And it's interesting looking back. This is something that I didn't think about at the time. I don't think anyone did. That though it claims to be a very general view, what is art, what is representation, and so forth, in fact, all of the examples and all of the machinery dealt completely with examples from European art. This is one of those sort of looking back that you say it's interesting that things that weren't in the book. Now, I didn't think about that at the time, and I didn't think about that when I moved across from philosophy to art criticism and art history, as Tom mentioned. I did start to think about this issue when I lectured in China a number of times and then lectured in India. And there's a kind of way in which the sorts of issues of a world art history are interesting academic issues that you can explore in a library or walking through the Met, but they look different when you actually go to the places and you have to face the questions of how do you describe these other cultures. The particular person who's got me to think about these issues is Jim Elkins, who has an interesting accounts of questions of how you can have a world art history. And I should acknowledge that some of what I say is going to come out of his writing, of disagreement with it. The other thing I should mention, I'm sort of trying to gain authority by putting Tom's big book, Shape of Ancient Thought, here, but why not? Because one needs authority for every project, is that there's an interesting analogy between what he's doing as a historian of philosophy and what I want to do here that I should talk about. And in some of our discussions, I see how far this analogy goes. He's interested primarily, I think, in transmission of ideas. You have Indian philosophy and you have Greek philosophy, and what are the connections? How do they work back and forth causally? What I'm interested in is the works of art, the art objects, and how are they connected back and forth between the cultures. But of course, you can't really separate the art and the philosophy in that way. So there's more than just an analogy of trying to understand the relationship of the cultures. So that's a kind of analogy that maybe after I finish, we should talk about. Now, let me introduce the lecture, and then I will a little more, and then we'll get to as I said, the text proper. This book in progress on multiculturalism has two parts. It doesn't have any technical jargon, but initially maybe some of the ways of thinking about it will seem unfamiliar. I think we can get into that easily. The first part presents the structure of a world art history, a proposed structure, and I consider a selection of that now. Now, it's obvious when you look at this that there's so much to see and read in so many languages that no one's qualified to write a world art history. I mean, looking at four traditions here, at Europe, at India, at Islam and China, I mean, who in the world, I mean, and there are other traditions I'm not even considering, but who in the world you say could cover all of that? I mean, Ola Gabar is maybe erudite enough to do a lot of Islamic art, and maybe Craig Clunas can do China, and Partha Minter can do India. But I mean, there's so much material that I think has inhibited the development of an art history. And of course, there's some analogies with Tom McEvilley's project, because there again you have to ask, who is it who knows enough about Greek philosophy and enough about Indian philosophy to make the cross connections between the two? So one has to, I think, to get this sort of project going, engage in a kind of leap, rely on a lot of secondary literature, and perhaps make mistakes, but that's, as I see it, the price of trying to get this thought about world art history going. Now, as I mentioned, the two parts, the first part is actually the history itself. The second part considers the moral and the political implications of this analysis. And that we don't have time to do tonight, but let me just say something briefly about what I take the issue to be, because I think that'll inform the sense of the first part. Now, we value the art from other cultures by presenting a collective history, a history like I'm presenting, or a museum display like a museum of world art history. And when I initially thought about this, I thought, well, this gives China, India, Islamic world what one could desire, namely a kind of mutual respect. In other words, we don't want a Eurocentric narrative. We want some larger narrative that takes account of all cultures. But then when I thought about it further, I became uneasy because I realized that this was politically naive. I mean, when the Met displays art from everywhere, after all, it does so on our American terms and our territory. And so I think a question about the multicultural art history is whether it isn't, though very wonderful in a kind of way, a sort of cultural imperialism, a kind of art historical equivalent to our intervention in Iraq. And I think that the moral issues of evaluating this are unsettling and difficult. That's slightly over the horizon tonight, but it's something maybe in the question period we can take up, and I urge you to press me on. Okay, so we where we are. First slide itself. Okay. Now I will read for a few minutes. When Thomas McEvilley invited me to speak, I felt very fortunate. For my book in progress, A World Art History and Its Objects, an essay in multicultural aesthetics, speaks to his central concerns. Earlier, my research focused on European art, but thanks to the lecture tours of China and India, I expanded my concerns. There are two reasons a world art history matters. It is intellectually challenging, and it is of great political importance right now. So I'm looking at four traditions: China, India, Europe, and Islamic world. Now, there's a certain idealization in speaking of these as separate traditions that intersect, and I'll try to say something about that. Now, 180 years ago, Hegel lectured on all forms of art with reference to all cultures, a kind of intellectual chutzpah. No one could do that now, but relying on the many specialists, a lot of quotations of them, sometimes not identifying by name, I'm trying to tease out a structure. Now, as some of these diagrams are homely, that's okay. It's convenient to present historical narratives as timelines, charting development by studying works of art, as here, left to right in chronological order of making. Temporal relationships are then translated into a visual structure. A timeline may present one stage in the development of an individual artist. Nicolas Poussin painted Hannibal crossing the Alps, mounted on an elephant here. Then the Battle of Gideon, both 1625, the battle a little later, and then the sack and destruction of the Temple at Jerusalem with Titus, 1625 to 6. So we have a small body of works of art, and the aim of scholarship, most notably Dennis Mann, is to present those on a proper timeline that covers just a short period of 2 years. A similar timeline is developed in accounts of Chinese landscape painting. Richard Barnhart says, quote, around 1085, I'm quoting him, a profound transformation occurred. The art of landscape painting was freed from subservience to the structure of empire to become the embodiment of individual human mind and experience. So here we would have another timeline of the same sort. Now, you see the move I'm making here that, while the particular different national traditions are very various, that the timeline is something universal. It's also that timelines can cover large territories. You can go from the Cimabue, Madonna and Child enthroned with angels and prophets, 1275 to 80, to Constable's Wivenhoe Park, 1816. So to go back and then forward here. And this is a kind of timeline that's familiar in Gombrich. Well, we have a timeline something like this. So a timeline can cover a small group of works as the Mons Poussins, or a big body of art here like Gombrich is doing. And of course we could fill in this with more details as needed. Now, these narratives identify real causal links. That is, the three Poussins marked the stages in his search for style, 1625 to 6, and here Cimabue and Constable define the origin and conclusion of European illusionistic tradition. So, to understand the relationship of the paintings, we need to look at how they fit on the timeline. To give another example, Sidney Friedberg argues that the Caravaggio St. John the Baptist with ram here is, quote, a translation into realist prose of the Michelangelo as here. And quoting Friedberg, maybe it helps to go back and look at that, Caravaggio is awed by what provokes him to attack. And like all acts of blasphemy, these of Caravaggio are inescapably ambivalent. So we have a timeline in which we understand the relation of the Caravaggio St. John to the earlier Michelangelo here. Chinese art history, too, is very rich in uses of tradition. Compared with the early northern Sung landscapes of Chuting, active 1023 to 1050, the valleys in a picture of a follower of Yun Wen working in the mid-13th century seem constrained and measurable. So here we have the Chuting, the summer mountains, and here we have the later picture, Buddhist temple in autumn mountains. So here again, we have two works of art that we're going to understand by putting them on a timeline. That is, we move from the earlier here to the later. And giving a bit of narrative to fill that out, at the time, historians write, a full-scale revival of Northern Sung styles was underway. This hand-scroll composition had become an important prototype for landscape painters who increasingly turned to art rather than nature for inspiration. So this is a story of Chinese art in this movement, and you can do this in a lot of other cultures as well. To give one example from India, historians observe that in earlier Indian sculpture, the Buddha's presence is indicated only symbolically, but gradually, by the 2nd century AD, we have, as here, the human image of Buddha introduced into northern India. So here again, we could have a narrative like the European ones, like the Chinese ones, of the development of Chinese art. Now, there are obviously many ways to organize a story of art, but what privileges narratives on timeline is a real history of making. You set Poussin's early paintings in order, you understand his style. When you link Cimabue with Constable, you reconstitute the story of European naturalism. So timelines structure the story of art as it really was. In China, India, and the Islamic world, as in Europe, artists come into traditions which they then modify. The works of art on a timeline are intimately connected. They constitute a tradition. And that's a kind of concept I'm going to be working with a lot in this talk. There are a sequence of causal connections between earlier and later artists. Now, Vasari, whose timeline we look at, writes, quote, "We owe a great obligation to those early craftsmen who showed to us, by means of their labors, the true way to climb to the greatest height. And with regard to the good manner of painting, we are indebted above all to Masaccio. He can be numbered among the first who cleared away in great measure the hardness, the imperfections, and the difficulties of art." So we have the earlier artists on the timeline on the left, Masaccio, and then we move toward Raphael and the art of Vasari's own time, including Vasari's own. Vasari tells the story of Italian art then from 1300 to his own day, 1550. Hegel's lectures on aesthetics, given in Berlin in the 1820s, a different model, construct a timeline running from Egypt to contemporary Romanticism. His differently organized history treats art as a form of social expression. In Egypt, on the left, building works, whether below or above the ground, are linked with the realm of the dead, as in general a realm of the invisible makes its home and occurs in Egypt for the first time. That's quoting Hegel. Then we get to the Greeks, where Hegel says the artist can set the empirical detail of particular incidents in complete and individual harmony with the general forms of the human figure. The universal element of the content is given to him by mythology and tradition. Then, quoting Hegel a little further, in Renaissance, painting proceeds more and more to associate art in the external world with religious subjects. The cheerful and powerful self-reliance of the citizens with their industriousness, their trade and commerce, their freedom, all of this is what entered artistic treatment and portrayal and asserted itself there. And finally, in the Hegelian account, we get to the golden age of Holland. Now, Hegel didn't get to any of these other countries. He did actually visit the Louvre. Well, he doesn't give a very illuminating account. The Louvre was new museum in the 1820s. But he did get to the Low Countries, and he does have evocative remarks of Holland. Holland, he links the art to, quote, to supreme freedom of artistic composition, fine feeling for incidentals, and perfect carefulness in execution, with freedom and fidelity of treatment, love for what is evidently momentary and trifling, the freshness of open vision, and the undivided concentration of the whole soul on the tiniest and most limited things. So here we have a timeline, a very differently organized timeline than Vasari's, but a timeline that employs a similar structure. Vasari treats Cimabue and Michelangelo as having the same goals. He says, I do not know, this is Vasari, what would have been said of Giotto if he had lived in the time of Michelangelo. Interestingly, you see that Vasari thinks of it as if you could ask, you see how, I'm going to go back, how these historically distant artists could be related. Hegel, by contrast, is a historicist. And this means that the Dutch masters for him don't try to rival their Italian precursors, that the Dutch artists show man's inner nature and its external and living forms and the forms of appearance. They have a naive delight in artistic freedom, a freshness and cheerfulness of imagination, and assured boldness of execution. The difference, in short, for Hegel is that the Dutch, as Protestants in a mercantile culture, have different goals from Italian Catholics, and so they make different sorts of art. Now, these obviously are very schematic plans, and no one would accept nowadays these Hegelian or Vasarian terms. But that doesn't interest me. That's just a point of detail. I'm interested rather in the idea that we can narrate these histories. In a minute, I'm going to be asking, you see, what happens when we go beyond these Eurocentric histories that only look at one culture and look at the larger world. Well, let's consider two more examples. The third one is Gombrich's. Like Vasari, Gombrich has a narrative showing the development of naturalism. But now the story is more complicated because to do the full story, you start in ancient Greece, and then you start again in the Renaissance. In Giotto's frescoes, Gombrich says, we seem to witness the real event as if it were enacted on a stage. And then in the High Renaissance, moving across the chart I draw here, quote, Leonardo could be as painstaking as any of his forerunners in the patient observation of nature. Only he was no longer the faithful servant of nature. And then in the Dutch Golden Age, again quoting Gombrich, specialists began to demonstrate that the subject of painting is much less important than one might have thought. Just as trivial words might provide the text for a beautiful song, so trivial objects can make a perfect picture. Finally, when we get the Constable on the right end there, quote, this is again Gombrich, we lose ourselves in the picture. To appreciate the artist's perfect sincerity, his refusal to be more impressive than nature, and his complete lack of pose or pretentiousness. So, like Vasari, Gombrich treats all of his artists as having the same goal. They all create naturalistic images, though as we move across the timeline, well, Giotto paints sacred scenes, the Dutch in the middle there do genre pictures, and Constable makes landscapes. Now, finally, the fourth example, helps to have a lot of them, is from Clement Greenberg. This fairly familiar account is a dialectical development that takes us from Old Master illusionism to modernism. Quoting Greenberg, the Old Masters preserved the integrity of the picture plane to signify the enduring presence of flatness underneath and the most vivid illusion of three-dimensional space. Modernism then, from Monet onward, reverses this way of thinking. It treats the limitations that constitute the medium of painting, the flat surface, the shape of the support, the properties of the pigment, as positive factors. So we have this whole fairly familiar history that takes us from Monet through to abstract expressionism. Now, it's interesting that Greenberg's account of old master art is very terse because, of course, what really interests him is modernism. Vasari, Hegel, Gombrich, and Greenberg narrate very different histories. You might contrast histories that treat the story of art as basically an internal development and those that give an external or sociological perspective. So for Vasari, Gombrich, and Greenberg, the history of art depends upon internal constraints. By contrast, for Hegel and his modern successors, namely the Marxist art historians, you can't understand how art develops without looking at the larger culture. So there are various differences in how the timelines are organized, and you'll notice that in putting up the bare timelines here, I've not said anything about what has to be filled in, namely how do we go from work of art as we go from left to right. And obviously, Greenberg has one kind of theory of how we get from old masters to Monet and Cubism. And just to go back, Gombrich here has a very different account. And indeed, we could go further back and say that Hegel has a different account. So there are lots of differences. But what all of these histories share, and this is the crucial thing for moving towards multiculturalism, is that they all think the works of art can be put on a timeline. That's the basic working assumption. Quoting Gombrich, there is a direct tradition handed down from master to pupil which links the art of our own days with the art of the Nile Valley of 5,000 years ago. End of quote. For Gombrich and Hegel, Egypt is part of Europe. Now, the differences, of course, are vast. Hegel thought that Africa had no history and that China and India created art of no real significance. Gombrich rejects those beliefs. He criticizes Hegel's view of art as social expression. But in Gombrich's big history, the story of art, art outside Europe only makes cameo appearances. The first chapter, there's a selection of European cave paintings, Australian Aboriginal drawings, and Maori, African, Oceanic, and Old American carvings. Indian art appears only briefly in Gombrich's book, and painting from Islam and China is bunched together in one chapter, a discussion of the European Middle Ages. The similarity there is that for Gombrich, in the European Middle Ages, as in Islam and China, mimesis is not the primary concern. That's, I think, a mistake, but that's, again, a point of detail. Now, in writing the history of this game, this tradition, as Gombrich identifies it, Vasari created a way of thinking which has remained influential, if you follow up to Greenberg here, into the mid-20th century. And giving a general description of this, quote, this idea of mankind being engaged in building up an autonomous realm of values which can somehow be conceived to exist beyond the individual's contribution and comprehension remains inspiring. So this is an idea that the significant works of art can be placed on one timeline. And to quote Greenberg's account, it has very different taste, but it has a similar view. He says, this is Clem Greenberg, quote, from Giotto to Courbet, the painter's first task has been to hollow out an illusion of three-dimensional space on a flat surface. One look through the surface is through a proscenium onto a stage. Modernism has rendered the stage shallower and shallower, end of quote. So that explains in an elliptical way the organizing principle of this timeline that we have here from left to right. You have that stage, the stage gets flatter. Many things change when you go from left to right. But you can organize the works on one timeline because you have this principle of the basic narrative. Imagine that Vasari meets Ernst Gombrich in the National Gallery, London. He would find many of the 15th and 16th century Italian paintings familiar, and Vasari, I think, could comprehend the Italian Baroque, for they extend this tradition. But what could he make of Cézanne or Seurat? If they retired to the Museum Café, the Tuscan would surely be bewildered by his successor's remarks about experimental psychology and Karl Popper's philosophy of science. But Vasari could immediately grasp Gombrich's concept of tradition. Constable, so Gombrich tells us, builds upon the achievements of Poussin and Claude Lorraine, extending the techniques of Gainsborough, quote, forging himself a language that is truthful and poetic, end of quote. If Vasari could then come to New York and meet Clement Greenberg at the Modern, he would be extremely puzzled by Cubism, Matisse, and abstract expressionism. But he could understand Greenberg's idea that modernists build on tradition. Quoting Greenberg, modernist art continues the past without gap or break, and wherever it may end up, it will never cease being intelligible in terms of the past, end of quote. Vasari thinks about art in just this way. So it's no accident that these four thinkers, Vasari, Hegel, Gombrich, and Greenberg, can all make these claims that you can arrange on a timeline because they share these interesting, deep assumptions. Gombrich and Greenberg took Vasari's and Hegel's Eurocentric historical ways of thinking into the mid-20th century. And it's astonishing, I think, that this timeline developed by Vasari has proven to be so supple. I mean, it's interesting that you can add to Vasari's timeline Cimabue, and you can also, if you follow Greenberg's account, add Morris Lewis to that same sort of timeline. That is, those objects fall within one tradition. Religious subjects ceased to be important. The social role of the artist dramatically changed, and abstraction was invented. The whole culture underwent dramatic metamorphosis. Mass art developed, art museums were created. But this is one European tradition because changes occurred in stages. Just as a person is a small infant, a gangly adolescent, and then a mature adult, their body changing dramatically as their mental powers develop, so an artistic tradition can develop dramatically. The same is true in other cultures. In China, for example, quoting one of the historians, calligraphers through the centuries have succeeded in developing enduring personal styles which in time contribute additional details of form to a tradition that has endured for almost 7,000 years. And in India, historian remarks, quote, the craftsman is a link in the unbroken chain of the tradition. Through his work, he confirms the continued presence of the masters. Take an example from Chinese art history. This comes from the historian Wen Fong. He opens his history of painting in China from the 8th to the 14th century by remarking that anyone who looks at 14th century Yuan dynasty literati landscape painting knows he's seen a dramatically different world from that portrayed in the monumental landscape images of the early Sung dynasty. So we can go from here in China here. Again, we can speak of a tradition. A tradition, thus, has a unity not possessed by a mere group of visually related artifacts. Donatello's sculptures and Indian Buddhas, Bruegel's landscapes and Chinese scrolls, Persian miniatures, and Renaissance book illustrations look a bit similar. A Donatello looks more like a Chinese Buddha than an abstract David Smith, and a Bruegel looks more similar to a Chinese scrolled into an abstract Sean Scully. But Donatello, Bruegel, Smith, and Scully work within European tradition, while Indian sculptors and Chinese and Persian painters belong to other traditions. So continuity isn't enough to define a tradition. You need these causal connections of works of art. These are what my timelines are showing. In Europe, for example, Masaccio influenced Perugino, who was the teacher of Raphael. And so we can put those three artists on one timeline. Now, the timeline itself doesn't tell us how the successive artists are connected. To do that, we need what I'm calling an aesthetic. For Vasari and Gombrich, European tradition is marked by progress in illusionism. Hegel offers a different theory, a social history of art. And Greenberg has yet a different aesthetic. So there are at least these three aesthetics for European art, and there could be others. But that, again, is a point of detail. The fact is that we are talking about these as distinct traditions. Now, what I'm going to start to do as I proceed here, of course, is to look outside the mere European traditions. But the working assumption here is we can speak of traditions here. One of the historians of Islamic art remarks that if you look at works of art from the world over, almost anyone could identify the Islamic works because they share a number of known features. The same is true of the Chinese, the European, and the Indian works of art, that there is what I'm calling this aesthetic. Now, sometimes aesthetics are spelt out by writers. Historian remarks that in Italy, in the 15th century, Alberti was a completely equipped humanist. But when he writes about painting, he no longer belongs with the humanist. He is instead a painter of a rather eccentric kind with access to humanistic resources. So the European aesthetic is developed by Alberti and others. There are contemporaries in the Chinese world. There again, there is a large literature of aesthetics. China and Europe develop aesthetics internally. It's a little more complicated to generalize in India and Islamic world. A lot of times those aesthetics need to be, I think, need to be worked out by outsiders. So we're looking at notions of traditions here and how the objects in those traditions are linked by an aesthetic, where an aesthetic explains the connection between successive works on the timeline. And also we're interested in how works of art change. We're interested in a market economy. Gombrich observes that from Florence to Rome, from Rome to Paris, and from Paris to New York, the problems of interest may change from realism to expression or articulation of the unconscious. He's thinking of abstract expressionism. But the momentum of the revolution that started in Florence was never spent. So in a sense, that tradition always involved this dissatisfaction and moving further. And in China, too, there seemed to have been something similar. So a tradition needs an aesthetic, it needs art criticism, it needs connoisseurship. And obviously I'm moving quickly here, but once we look at these features of a tradition, then we start to see that very different cultures have something like the features of the European tradition. Now, within a tradition, you can have dramatic change. Henri Matisse was the great admirer of Cézanne. He was the pupil of Gustave Moreau, I show here, and he in turn influenced Richard Diebenkorn as here. Now, it would take a long story to relate, to get us from Gustave Moreau to Diebenkorn, but we're familiar with those kinds of stories, and I don't need to tell it here, because what I'm interested in is the idea, the more abstract idea, that there is a tradition that stage by stage takes us from Gustave Moreau through early Matisse, through to later Matisse, and then on to a very Matisse artist, though abstract, namely Richard Diebenkorn. So we have something like a tradition. What I want to argue is that those changes within a tradition are different in kind from what happens when you have independent parallel traditions. And now I have to start moving outside of Europe. Before there was sustained contact between distant cultures, China, Europe, India, and the Islamic world were, a lot of the time, on separate timelines. Like Europe, China has a long, mostly self-sufficient tradition. I show three figures here in China from around the year 1000 forward. Now, the aim of the historians of Chinese art is to spell out the causal connections. How do you get from the GUI to the artist on the right? How do you make those causal connections? Now, obviously, I'm not trying to do all of those details because to some extent here, again, this is division of labor, I need to rely on the specialized scholarship. I'm interested in the broader structure. Now, the thought is something like this. First approximation. We have here, and we'll fix it in a minute, we have two parallel timelines. We have China's history and we have Europe, and to some degree they are running in parallel. Now let me talk about that and we'll qualify it. Until Giuseppe Castiglione and the Jesuits arrived in China, there was no systematic ongoing contact between the traditions. That's why I show them as parallel timelines, left to right. Cimabue and Raphael didn't know their Chinese peers of the same dates. Cimabue and Raphael are on one timeline, and their Chinese peers, Rembrandt and Tang Yin, same dates, are on another. That's how I represent it there. India, of course, has another complicated tradition, and as the McEvely book remarks, thanks in part to Alexander the Great, there was early contact with Europe, and there are complicated movements back and forth. Oleg Grabar, describing this bit of history, says, quote, during the first century after the conquest, rise of Islam, the Muslims were brought into immediate contact with the fantastic artistic wealth of the Mediterranean and Iran. They were strongly affected by a world in which images, buildings, and objects were active expressions of social standing, religion, political allegiance, and intellectual or theological positions. Now, what this means is that now we need a third timeline. Now, I show the Islamic one as beginning at that date, beginning with the founding of Islam itself. One way to understand what happens in Islam there is to note that the Quran itself reworks the Hebrew and Christian Bibles. Many figures appear in a novel context. For example, quoting the Quran, those who say God is the Messiah, son of Mary, have defied God. The Messiah himself said, children of Israel, worship God, my Lord and your Lord. If anyone associates others with God, God will forbid him from the garden, and hell will be his home. So this is a radical revision of the way Christians understand the role of Christ in Judaism and so forth. Well, it's a different tradition, theologically as in the art. Now, what we need then, the world art history line, and I show this tentatively. I've gone one back forward here. But that's okay, because what I want to indicate is that we have these four timelines, and we have some cross connections. Now, we could make more cross connections in detail, but that's a further up the line thing. What we want to see on the timeline is how when we move across the horizontal timeline, we view the successive works in that tradition. And when we move vertically, as when I show China influencing India or Europe influencing Islam and so forth, then we have the intersection of the different traditions. Now, let me talk about that. When traditions intersect, previously distant cultures make contact. Alexander the Great led his Greek army into India, influencing Buddhist sculpture. And Buddhism migrated from India to China. It brought along motifs. And of course, Islam's art history is especially complicated because though it originated close to Europe, it was always very concerned to maintain its independence. Quoting Grabar again, insofar as the Muslim conquest was very rarely destructive, it can be taken for granted that earlier artistic traditions continued at almost every level of creation and patronage, and that their production was used by Muslims and non-Muslims alike. So it's going to be complicated to spell out this line, but it seems to me a reasonable approximation to say that the traditions developed in relative independence. Looking at a bit of the history, Early on, the Europeans knew something vague and inaccurate about Africa and Asia, but of course they knew nothing about America and its inhabitants, so that when Europeans got to the Americas, they responded to these world only on their own terms. One of the things about the intersections one would need to talk about is what extent borrowings are taking place and when are they not. When the Europeans conquered the New World, the Aztec and the Mayan art was too exotic to them to affect their paintings and sculptures. So this chart then is something of an ideal model, but it's very useful because what it shows, if you think back to my earlier charts, is that the Eurocentric timeline, that is the timeline that Vasari had and that Hegel developed and that Gombrich developed and that Greenberg developed also, can't be the whole story, that there has to be something more. There have to be other parallel timelines. Now, when Europeans first started to reflect on this, they had a lot of problems. They had problems with Indian art. Quoting one of the authorities, through the whole Hindu pantheon, you will look in vain for anything resembling those beautiful and majestic forms which stood in the shrines of ancient Greece. All is hideous and grotesque and ignoble. So this is the initial problem. Now, to put it in terms of my structure, the problem there is to think, you see, that the Indian timeline has to map onto the European one, but that's not a mistake. A particular famous example, the Europeans were unprepared for the erotic Indian sculpture. The sculptures show exhibitionism, intercourse, homosexual relations, oral sex, bestiality, and orgies. It's interesting to read a secular art historian, Roger Fry, in his early 20th century account of Indian art. Quoting Fry, a great deal of their art, even their religious art, is definitely pornographic. And although I have no moral prejudices against that form of expression, kind of Bloomsbury idea, it generally interferes with aesthetic considerations by imposing a strong, irrelevant interest which tends to distract both the artist and the spectator from the essential purposes of a work of art. Now, you can see what's gone wrong there. What Fry is imagining is that there can't be a parallel timeline with a different aesthetic, that somehow the Indian art has to be doing the same things as familiar European art. And that, of course, is simply a mistake. Now, other cultures had these sorts of misunderstandings. In the 11th century, a Central Asian astronomer, al-Biruni, went to India, and he was, quote, scandalized by Hindu religious beliefs, sexual habits, and social customs. Taken together, they demonstrated to his satisfaction the essential foulness of Indian culture against the manifest superiority of Islamic institutions. End of quote. Europeans had a lot of problems when they went to India. Quoting one of the accounts, that moderation, which in the West appears as the fundamental condition of artistic production, is unknown to the Hindu, because he never proceeds from the idea of a complete whole, perfect in itself, but from the conception of individual figures. To him, the work of art is the sum total of single and individual elements. End of quote. So, the failures of these initial multicultural explorations come from the belief that everything has to be on one timeline. But that's simply not the case. To understand another culture, you have to see that they can have a different aesthetic. Part of the problem that Europeans had with India initially was that the art looked exotic because the religious ideals were exotic. The best-known icon of Vishnu shows him sleeping upon the endless serpent of eternity, afloat on the ocean of unresolved essence. From his navel a lotus springs and unfolds to reveal the creative deity, Brahma, whose function is the active propagation of the material worlds, channeling through himself the existential force of Vishnu. Now, you see the problem there, if you are a Christian believer and know nothing else, what sense can you make of this work of art? Or, when you go to Elephanta, near Mumbai, Shiva appears in various monumental sculpted tableaux. European art doesn't have any remotely similar subjects. So, the initial context between cultures always involve these kinds of misunderstandings, and they go both ways. When the Jesuits came to China, the Chinese found the examples of European art bewildering. Quoting an account of the Chinese, the European artists were not to Chinese artists' eyes very good at depicting landscape. Their portraits and paintings of the Virgin might seem dazzlingly real, like images in a mirror, but their pictures of rocks and trees and mountains, which demanded more than an illusionistic technique, cannot have seemed very convincing as representations. Any good Chinese artist drawing on his native tradition could have painted rocks that looked more like rocks in nature than these. So it's very interesting, again, on both sides, these systems of misunderstanding. Now, it's easy for us to joke about these now, but if you think about it, when a culture is relatively isolated, of course, it's going to take its own ways of thinking for granted. What else could it do? And it's only after working through the shock and the trauma of intersections with another culture that you can go beyond a monocultural art history, that is one timeline, whether it be European, Indian, or whatever, to recognizing that there have to be many timelines. The Chinese found European perspective and shading all wrong. Quoting one of the accounts, the Europeans know how to represent light and shade, distance and proximity. They paint palaces and rooms on walls, imitating reality so closely that you imagine you are confronted by a real palace and are about to enter it. Their paintings are nothing but skilled craftsmanship. Well, what looks like the high point of European painting to Gombrich or Vasari is something that to the Chinese simply seemed all wrong, and vice versa the other way. Now, what happens when you have this intersection of cultures? Well, you could, of course, hold that your own beliefs, your own aesthetic are correct and those of everyone else are wrong, but that way is merely dogmatic parochialism, and trying to understand what's exotic seems a more productive strategy. If you isolate yourself from other cultures, you're doomed to provincialism. And once this kind of argument was thought of, then it seems to me inevitable that there would be some sort of a need for multiculturalism. So, what have we shown? There's no universal monocultural art history. There's no single timeline telling the history of everything in one story. You can't extend Vasari in the way that Gombrich did to encompass art from all cultures. You have to have something like those parallel timelines that I present. Now, the implications of this fact only became obvious when, in the 19th century, Europeans looked seriously at art from other cultures. But even in Vasari's day, that is 1550, when Lives of the Painters, Sculptors, and Architects appeared, already the Europeans had conquered the New World and sailed to India and China. Well, being interested in another culture is something new. It's only when that kind of monoculturalism was overcome that the implications of those voyages could be understood in terms of art history. It's very interesting that it took that many centuries for the concerns to be thought about. Well, nowadays, of course, globalization has shrunk the world, shifted relations, and the world is one. However you make art, you may be attached to your local ways, but you can hardly be unaware of other cultures. So that what we need now is to understand what these parallel timelines and intersecting lines are like. Now, the diagram shows that after 1522, Vasco de Gama and the first circumnavigation of the globe, that the traditions of Europe, China, India, and Islamic world started to merge, but it doesn't tell what those mergings were like. Well, let's say something about that. You have the marvelous Persian painter Bizards, 1460 to 1535. He reworks Persian tradition. And quoting a bit of account of this miniature, what is new is the life brought to every detail, especially to the human figures. But though he is an exact contemporary of Raphael here, it's clear that no mutual influence would be possible. I mean, if you ask yourself, what could Bizards have made of Raphael or vice versa, you say, well, at this point, the artistic traditions are too far apart, or in terms of my diagram, the parallel lines are too distant for there to be interesting intersections. Van Eyck and Holbein couldn't make use of all-over Islamic carpet designs, and as we've seen, the Ming Dynasty Chinese were not interested in European perspective. Albrecht Dürer was fascinated by the wonderful works of art that were brought from the New World, the pre-Columbian art, but they had no effect on his development. Rembrandt drew Mughal subjects, but he didn't adopt a Mughal coloring. And if you think about that, quoting an account, interesting to look at the color here, remarking, in Western painting, colors are rarely left their full intensity. They are killed. A red will be slightly reduced in status towards pinkish brown or tainted with green in order to harmonize it with neighborly color tones. The early Punjab painters did exactly the opposite. To them, a pure, clear color in all its brilliance was beautiful in its own right. Well, what, of course, the Indian commentator is talking about is someone like Bonnard. So Rembrandt couldn't, you see, follow my account, have made, I mean, he could have painted the subjects of Indian painting. The color, using that was over the horizon. But of course, when you get to Bonnard, on one hand, there was communication. Each leader successfully conveys to the other both his position of authority and his desire that their meeting be friendly and have mutual respect. On the other hand, there is miscommunication as the two struggle to find a common ground between cultures where they have very different ideas of power. Or consider what happened when the Portuguese, led by Vasco de Gama, go to India. There were elaborate misunderstandings. The Indians were shown an altarpiece, quoting the European account, that represented Our Lady at the foot of the cross. When the Indians saw the picture, they threw themselves on the deck and uttered extended prayers. Later, they shouted the words the Portuguese heard as Christ, Christ. The reality was somewhat different. The image had a close resemblance to one that the Hindus in this region worshiped, and the words actually were Krishna, Krishna. The Portuguese, in other words, took the Indians to be Christians, realizing that they weren't Muslims, therefore they must be Christians. What else could they be? Not knowing that there was something else in the world, namely Hindus. So the contexts are complicated, and travel alone did not create a multicultural art. Some cultures, of course, were simply destroyed by Europeans, Native American cultures. Stronger societies like India were colonized, or like China and the Islamic world, were transformed. And when the intersecting traditions were far enough apart, sometimes artists had the option to abandon their tradition and take up an exotic one. Chinese, Indian, and Islamic artists learned to make oil paintings, and the figure Castiglione I mentioned earlier, the Jesuit, 1688 to 1766, he became a skilled Chinese painter, working in a Chinese style. Sometimes artists borrow from exotic traditions. Here we have the Persian artist, Bizards, showing a portrait of a painter in a Turkish costume, and this copies the Italian Costanza di Ferrara. So there the traditions were close enough, going back to the miniature here and then looking at the Italian one, that you could actually have this moving back and forth. The Emperor Akbar, who ruled in India 1556 to 1605, he was fascinated by foreign luxury goods, and he was interested in European art, and so in his court there were a lot of copies. Hans Holbein's The Ambassadors incorporates an Islamic artifact, the carpet, within a European painting. There were a lot of these carpets, luxury goods, because they were very expensive in Europe in the Renaissance, that were incorporated within the works of art as isolated objects. Certainly the Europeans didn't understand anything about Islamic carpets. They weren't particularly interested. These were simply fascinating things, like all of the other objects between the two ambassadors. Recently, effectively reversing the process, some Islamic works of art include representations of European elements. These rugs of war, as they're told, made in Afghanistan or nearby by refugees living in Pakistan, they show Russian and American airplanes, guns, anti-aircraft missiles, and so forth. They are the terrifying images of aggressive Western culture as seen by its victims. Now, to do business with another culture, you must have something to exchange. But you can trade without knowing or caring much about the culture. Europeans imported Islamic carpets, and Greek texts were translated into Arabic. But there was, in many cases, a lot of movement back and forth in the cultures. It's interesting to look at this history. In the early Renaissance, quoting one of the historians, quote, West remained, for the Muslims, essentially an area of little interest at the cold fringes of the civilized world, producing slaves, furs, and other raw materials to be exchanged for the refined wares manufactured in the Middle East. So the fact that the cultures are in contact doesn't mean that there is going to be some synthesis, some kind of art moving back and forth. To give another example, in 751, the Muslims captured Chinese paper makers and soon printed Qurans, but they didn't make, the Muslims didn't make scroll paintings. So sometimes the connections of the cultures only led to limited exchanges. Cultures had different views, and that influenced what scientific mathematical techniques could move back and forth. To give one interesting example, about the commerce between China and Rome, ancient Rome, the Chinese, with their preference for light housing, heavy clothes, and concentrated warmth, used silk as brocade, a heavy textile, while the Romans, with their preference for heavy housing, light clothes, and diffused warmth, used it as gauze, a light textile. So one of the things that happens in these cultural movements, and you have to think not only of art going back and forth, and as Tom talks about in the book, ideas, but as foodstuffs, inventions, and of course, alas, military technology, is that you learn in these exchanges what parts of the culture are parochial. The Muslims, for example, wanted European weapons, but not Christian theological tracts. They translated Greek philosophy, but not classical theater. In a number of paintings, early 20th century, Henri Matisse presents in a radically revelatory way his interest in Islamic art and decoration. The Holbein I showed a minute ago sets the carpet within a European painting. Matisse here treats the whole painting as if it were carpet-like, that all-overness extending through the entire space. So at this point, we have not simply an isolated object moving back and forth between the cultures, but rather, to go back to my timeline, a kind of merging of those traditions. Now, Matisse's achievement here was prepared for by scholarship. 1856, Owen Jones' great pioneering treatise, The Grammar of Ornament, describes Islamic art in terms that retain their interest even today. Quoting a bit of Owen Jones, the early edifices of the Mohammedans were either old Roman or Byzantine buildings adapted to their own uses, or buildings constructed on the ruins and with the materials of ancient monuments. The new wants to be supplied and the new wants to be expressed, it must at an early period have given a peculiar character to their architecture. And when Owen Jones studies this, it's a really elaborate history of patterns. I just show the one there. He starts to do a comparative art history. So if you want to trace the roots of a true multicultural art history, a fair author to name would be Owen Jones, again, 1856, because he treats all of these decorative traditions as, he thinks they're of unequal value, but they're all interesting, they're all worth comparing and contrasting. These ideas were picked up by the Viennese scholar Rigo in the 1890s, and he dies in 1905. But when there was an enormous exhibition of Islamic art held in Munich, 1910, his followers wrote the catalog essays, and that's the causal connection to Matisse. In other words, some of Matisse's ideas, and maybe even clearer, and let me go back in this painting here, of the carpet being the model, not just for an element in the painting, but the whole painting, have to do with this contact with Islamic art. Now, understanding those connections there is very complicated, but again, for the purpose of my world art history, it does show that those timelines are no longer parallel, but they are merging. That is, the Islamic aesthetic is something that we find being worked out in European painting by Matisse here. Well, when traditions are far apart, how can we map their connections? Swann's Way, the first volume of Proust's In Search of Lost Time, is so named because on his walks, Marcel's family encounters two ways. They seem dramatically opposed. There's literally two ways that they walk out of the house, the country house in Cambrai. One way is Swann's Way. This is that of the prosperous middle-class family. The other, by contrast, the Gramantes Way, belongs to the grand aristocratic world, which, as explained in the novel, quote, during the whole of my boyhood was as inaccessible as the horizon, a kind of abstract geographic term like the North Pole or the equator or the Orient, end of the quote. But at the end of the novel, the last volume, Time Regained, Marcel discovers that these two ways are not so far apart. In fact, they are linked together. Now, something like that is what I think has to be done in a world art history. That is, we have these separate traditions, the structure I've traced, and we know that starting in 1522, the circumnavigation of the globe, everything changed. So soon enough, we're going to have this one world art history, and the aim then is to work out the implications of that connection. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks. I want to say how happy I am that I asked you to come here and do this, and how gratifying I find everything that you've said. I mean, it seems like an historic moment to me, frankly. Sure. Yeah, I think that I get the impression that you haven't publicly exposed this aspect of your work very much.
No.
And I feel privileged that you do so here and to us. I think New York is the appropriate place to do it, and I'm absolutely delighted. I'm kind of overwhelmed, really, that your outlines suggest. I think that you said in the passage that you gave us that we used in the poster, I think you said, we need a world art history, and you said something like, I offer a preliminary version of it. Well, you've done a fantastic job already. and I can't wait for more of it. There's so much, and you've begun to turn the key in the lock, and there's so much more, but I'm already very excited about what you've showed us. I mean, merely to witness a lecture where someone talks about and shows Chinese, Indian, Islamic, and European works is in itself a thrill that I don't think I've ever had before, you know. I mean, we who deal with art in the West do so in a narrow path, in a narrow mold, and your I loved especially the one where you show all four timelines together, and I know I asked you before we started, in the passage that we quoted in the poster, you said around 1520 the world became one, and I was curious about that, but you've answered it. I guess the reason you said around 1520 was because you were thinking of 1522. Yeah. But then again, along with Vasco de Gama's circumnavigation, which is, it is like opening the curtain on a new age of the world. Along with that, the beautiful detail that you mentioned that Cortez and Montezuma shook hands in 1519, kind of closing in on the date from both sides. And so in that timeline picture, you had the four timelines, and the bottom three, the Islam was at the top, and the bottom three on the right, their lines all converge in 1520. Right. But the Islamic line you didn't bring down into that convergence. Yeah. Maybe you could comment on that.
Yeah, we go back on that timeline. It's not too far back. Like a couple more minutes. Yeah. What interested me, Tom, is you see this parallel structure before 1522 and others before, because at that point, I mean, basically the lines are parallel but not intersecting. After that point, it's much harder, because this, in a sense, is someone who wants to do wants to be a curator of contemporary art. And so, well, look, on one hand, obviously, Islamic art has a separate identity as the Chinese when you go there and so forth. But on the other hand, everyone is looking at art form, is looking at art in America, is looking at the journals. People are traveling back and forth. The objects are moving around. And so clearly, at that point, the whole plan has changed. I mean, we're no longer talking about the kind of radical isolation that you have earlier in history. How to do the present, that's then a question of mutual influences between the cultures. And there, I think, you see, one has to do it case by case. I mean, in China, for example, a few years ago, when I taught in the art school for a month of Hangzhou, it's a very odd system that the art school, one like this, if you will, has two parallel streams. One is Western art, which is sort of coming out of 19th century French academic painting, and what the students are painting are things that look like Gérôme and Bouguereau, but with Chinese subjects and Chinese figures and so forth. The other side of the Hangzhou is that they are doing traditional Chinese media, that is, brush on paper, though the subjects look untraditional. So China, in that way, you see, now has split up the art school and said that you come to art school and you can choose either to paint, you see, like a Westerner, or to paint like a traditional Chinese. So obviously, in the present, the traditions in every case are really complicated, but that's sort of off to the right of the side here, and I don't have so much to say about that.
David, I'm back here now.
Okay.
I don't want to prevent other people from talking, but maybe we could talk
Please.
A little more. I just want to repeat, I'm utterly thrilled by what you've presented to us, and I think it's absolutely historic. I don't know anyone who has done this before. Mm-hmm. And it's the, if there is a future, it's the way of the future. And you have opened an incredible door. And I think you've done it competently and extremely intelligently and eruditely.
Thanks, yeah.
I'm just overwhelmed and fascinated by it. And I think this is something that you and I will probably be talking about for years.
Yeah.
And
Sure.
I remember another remark that you made that left a big question mark in my mind. If I remember it rightly, you said that the aesthetics of the Chinese and Islamic traditions will have to be worked out by outsiders. Mm-hmm. Did you say that?
Right.
Could you expand on that?
Sure. Now, let me put this word aesthetic with the diagram here in this technical sense, because remember that on each of these four parallel lines, what we have is a bunch of objects, right? And so the timeline merely gives chronology, the Giotto leads to Masaccio, leads to Raphael, et cetera, on the different, an equivalent in the Islamic world, in China and India. The question of the aesthetic is, what's the form of those connections? And there, I sketched the four European examples, Vasari, Hegel, Gombrich, and Greenberg, because I think in a general way we can rely on those theories. When we get to the other cultures, things are a lot more difficult. Now, as far as I can make out, here's the story. Now, remember that this is the problem with this subject, is that no one knows enough to do all of this, and so, one has to rely on the specialists. That China has a very elaborate history of art writing. They're big anthologies, and I'm reading these in English, that try to tease out these histories. And even the basic questions are hard to figure out. For example, is the history of Chinese art a history like Vasarian progress in naturalism? In other words, from less naturalistic to more naturalistic. Some people say no, some people say yes. Part of the problem with the Chinese is that there are elaborate arguments about the translations. And if you think about it, you see, to the extent that the Western ideas come out of a Christianized culture, the difficulty you see of coming from a culture with a completely different view of nature and what gods are, and Taoism and what order is, and translating that, in other words, so that on the timeline I have here, explaining how from left to right in China, we have what kind of aesthetic that we have, that's very difficult. When you get to India and Islam, what the authorities tell me, Grabar, for example, I take to be the one I follow in Islam, is that there you don't have within the tradition any equivalent of Vasari. There are parochial Vasaris. There is a 17th century Persian figure, I think Dust Muhammad is the name, who writes a lot about the details of Persian miniatures of that century. But you don't seem to have within Islam anyone who has a large-scale aesthetic. In other words, who says things like, well, starting around 1650 in the Christian era, we have this, and then we have a different art. In other words, explaining how that top timeline there, how this set of objects are organized. Now, you see, one can ask, one question is, why don't you have an Islamic Vasari? And that, of course, is a very complicated question. See, sometimes, as in all of this debate about the cartoons, you hear people say things like, well, Muslims don't allow representations. Not true. Or even that Muslims don't allow representations of Muhammad, but not true. You can look in the books, there are images of Muhammad that then other Muslims defaced. So there are internal arguments within Islam there. But something like an Islamic aesthetic, a systematic one, well, that's hard to find. And I take it similarly with India. You see, there may be things, there may be a developed vocabulary for dance, certainly developed vocabulary for poetry, but for the visual art, and of course India is particularly tricky because, well, Coles to Newcastle, same to you, Tom, but you have the Buddhism, and then you have the Hindu world, then you have Islamic world, then you have the Christian world. So how you represent the Indian line there and you separate it from the others, that's a very complicated sort of question. This chart is a first approximation. It's a kind of idealization, but you see, we need that, acknowledging all of its defects, even to get the idea of a multicultural art history off the ground, acknowledging that then how we fill it out is going to take lots of fiddling.
Okay, I'll keep on for just a little while, and then I'll pass this microphone around. But you mentioned the New World twice. Once when you mentioned that incredible moment when Cortez and Montezuma shook hands. But then you said something about the Mayan and Aztec traditions. Now, I wonder, in constructing your multicultural art history, I understand that you have to draw some limits, and you've made these four timelines.
Sure.
Now, what about the New World? What about the pre-Columbian New World? Is there maybe a dotted line somewhere?
My sense there, and this is simply, you see, ignorance. I mean, I've also left out, just to add the number of things, I left out Japan. I've left out all of Oceania, that is what happens with Maori art in New Zealand and so forth. I've left out Africa. You see, I've left out quite a few things, in other words, even to get to this degree of approximation. But in the case of pre-Columbia's or Old Americas, there it seems you have a kind of timeline that simply comes to a terminus. In other words, that culture doesn't continue, whereas part of the interest of these four high art traditions is that, you see, to some degree we can say that Islamic and Chinese and European and Indian are all ongoing traditions, that they continue up into the present, whereas what do we have of, let's say, the Aztec or Mayas? Well, we have a certain number of the objects, and I mean, of course, so horrifyingly many of them were destroyed. And we have a European record, but a European record that is, let me see if I can find that slide. You see, it's like the, it's like the Holbein taking the Islamic carpet and making it an object within the painting, but you see, not being interested in what I would call the Islamic aesthetic. In other words, the carpet in this painting or the other painting of these period is simply a luxury good from a culture that otherwise, Europeans didn't care anything about. So how you deal with a culture like that that's simply been destroyed? Well, you have a timeline that simply comes to a conclusion, and that's it. It doesn't go any further. That's the story.
The last question I will ask before passing the microphone around is, how do you plan to deal with the value judgment?
Yeah. The value judgment, let me again go back if I can find my nice line here. Oh, it's back a little ways. Is kind of interesting because the mere fact that I show parallel lines here, you see, and complain about all those other people, Roger Fry and the others, who said basically, I mean, as Europeans, well, the Hindu stuff, it isn't really art. It's so bad, it's so defective, it's too erotic, or it's too whatever, or the Chinese isn't. You see, is to say already there's a value judgment implied in the fact that I have four timelines rather than one. Because Hegel's view is that there's only one timeline. And Hegel's very clear on that. He has this bizarre judgment. He says, well, look at China. The sun rises in the east. What he means by that is then nothing continues in China. That has no history. Now, obviously, this is a fanciful kind of idea, but to put it in a simple phrase, Eurocentrism means you have one timeline. You think all the objects of value are on that. The multiculturalism, as I use that word, and people have other uses, is to say, well, you have these parallel timelines. Islam has an aesthetic, China has an aesthetic, Europe and India. And to some extent, we're going to say, well, these are separate and equal. And that's what showing them on separate timelines means, that we are acknowledging a kind of equality. Now, one way that I thought about on this that may help to think is that because I have this book on the art museums coming out this June, is that when you walk into a grand museum like the Met, what you see to some approximation working out spatially is you see something like this timeline structure. Think of it, and you have to imagine that the Islamic galleries, they've been closed for a while now, but they're open. You go to the top of the stairs and you make a decision. If you go straight ahead, you go through the European art history, and you go through something like a timeline. I mean, you have to make various tracings back and forth, but that's sort of a contingency of the museum. If you go to the right, you go through China, and then you go a bit towards the front on Fifth Avenue, and then, of course, you go through India, and you go upstairs, you continue India. If you go to the left at the top of the stairs, after some other things, of course, you get into the Islamic wing. And so, again, to some approximation, what a museum of world history, or world art history shows is something like these structures. And see, one way to answer your question is that the basic supposition of the Met is that Islamic art has its own values, Chinese has its own values, Indian, and so forth, and that those are not reducible to European values, nor, you see, any other reducible. That is, they are separate and distinct, and that's why we house them in separate wings. One way to put this point, you see, polemically about the separate timelines is, imagine you went to Philippe de Montebello and you organized the Met differently, you proposed. You say, look, let's have a very long corridor like the Grand Gallery in the Louvre, and let's put from the year 1200, the year 1250, the year 1300, and so forth, let's put objects from every culture. In other words, from 1250, let's have Chinese paintings next to Hindu sculptures, next to European art, next to Islamic art. Now, I think we would all feel this is a deeply incoherent arrangement, right? We said, but why is it incoherent? You said, well, because in 1250, Chinese art had nothing to do with European art. Islamic art had nothing to do with, you see, European art. And what that nothing to do means, to put it in my diagram, which is simple, is that they are on still parallel timelines. Now, in the present, we don't think that. I mean, in the present, we think, well, people can still be painting in a Chinese style, but you can't be unaware of all of the other traditions. This is not possible at this date.
Thank you. Let me offer the opportunity to speak to others.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, are you, in your survey, your investigation, going to account also for the different concepts of time and of line that those cultures, from Africa to pre-Columbian to China to whatever, might have? In other words, maybe are we applying our concept of time and of line in looking at them, and would there be an accounting also of these other perspectives?
Yeah. Now that's a very interesting kind of issue. We are applying our concept of time to the extent that these left-right connections of the simple timeline are privileged because those are all causal connections. That is, we think that earlier influences later, but not the other way around. Now, the case of India in particular, of course, and this is again calls to Newcastle here, is particularly complicated because if you believe in reincarnation and circular time and so forth, then, you see, then you're going to have a real problem. And one of the things that I take up in my account is a kind of interesting issue, just focusing on that, is that I ask, could another culture have such an exotic aesthetic, that is a way of thinking, a metaphysics, that we simply couldn't make sense of their art at all? That is, that we felt that we couldn't map it onto our structures entirely. And that's a very difficult question. One example that I found very interesting are the parallels with ethics. And let me sketch that, if I can, for a moment briefly. There's a very general theory of ethics of John Rawls that goes something like this, and it's liberalism with a small l, is that we take for granted that there are differences and differences have to be earned, and then there are elaborate theories of privilege. But we think, in a very broad way, I mean liberals, again, in a small l, that all things being equal, differences are only fair if they benefit everyone. And, you know, these are familiar sorts of arguments. Now, here's a kind of example from multiculturalism that throws that seriously for a loop. Suppose you believe in reincarnation, and you say, well, your just desserts are determined not just by your own talents and by your family and by the social institutions that privilege, you know, access to higher education, but they are determined what you did in many previous lives. In other words, perhaps if you are suffering certain ways in this life, it's because in past lives you did various things that are now have to be, worked through. Now, at that point, obviously, liberalism with a small L completely breaks down. And, no kind of Rawlsian theory is going to deal with that. And clearly there are parallels with visual art, aren't there? Objects that are just incomprehensible. The local example I think of, this wonderful Rubin Museum on 17th Street, because you look at the Buddhist art, and if you have confidence, you see, in your ability to understand iconography, and you look at the Buddhist scenes, you say, uh-oh. And there's the sense that interpretation falls into real great difficulties.
Yes.
I found it surprising, especially when we looked at the Raphael a little later, that Roger Fry, in looking at Hindu mythology, didn't see the relationship between that and Greek mythology. There must have been...
I see. Well, the case, when he looks at the Hindu art, he is genuinely perplexed. But let me put it in relation to a couple other things of Fry. You see, when I speak of this monocultural side, he also had problems with Christian Baroque art, with Caravaggio, for example. And he has the famous dismissive opinion, Caravaggio, and this is, when Caravaggio is just starting to be rediscovered before the present apotheosis. He says, Caravaggio is like a film director. Now, this, you see, in Bloomsbury language is a dramatic put-down. He has these dramatic scenes close up. They are pure illustration and nothing more. He's contrasting the bad Caravaggio to the good Poussin, who has the formal relations in space. So Fry has a monocultural aesthetic. And what I mean by that in terms of the diagram right here, there's only one line. He thinks that everything can be understood in these formal terms. He has other eccentric judgments. He thinks, for example, that some African sculpture is much greater than anything the Greeks produced. But it's greater, you see, in these formal terms. He doesn't think that you need to study Africa in any way. He thinks simply that with the formalist eye, you can see that it's better. So Fry has one line. Africa goes on it, Greece so-so, Caravaggio falls off, the Hindus fall off. It's not completely Eurocentric, but it is one aesthetic. Now, it's against that, you see, that I'm arguing here. I'm saying, no, you have to have these multiple aesthetics. Because I take it for granted that no single interesting aesthetic is going to deal with both Hindu art and classical Greek art. And once you recognize that, now you may say that's a very simple point, but see, again, if we go back to my history, the world is rounded in 1522, but look how long, you see, it took art historians into the 20th century, see, 4 centuries, to get through the implications of that. In other words, to get to something like this simple diagram that we have here took 4 centuries. And before that, you had people saying, well, either it's on our timeline, damn it, or it's nothing. But you see, I want to be clear. It's not just the Europeans saying that, but it's also the Chinese saying this European art, it's just skilled, but it's nothing. And similarly in the other cultures. So it's interesting. It took a very long time for cultures to look across and say, those others are different from us, but what they're doing is valid in their terms, and what we're doing is valid on ours. They simply are different. Now, you can sense from the tone there that the part 2 I didn't present about all the moral issues, how that's in the background. But you see, it's once you have all these timelines and all these differences, different aesthetics, then you say, but what about how can these cultures coexist in one world right now? And that's obviously the difficult question, because how can I put it? It's easy for them to coexist in the Met, because after all, they coexist aesthetically, right? You got the Chinese, you got the Islamic, and so forth. But if you say, as living cultures in the world, how can they coexist? That's trickier. A great impression was made on me a few years ago. I was taking this tour, and there was a point when in the Louvre they had what they call the cultures without writing, and one doesn't say primitive anymore, but in other words African and so forth. And the wall label said, with pride, French pride, well, now all of these can coexist. To which the answer is yes, they coexist in Paris, but it's not as if you see in Nigeria you have the French works of art, the European works of art. And obviously we all understand this is an imperial history that meant that African art is in Europe, but European masterpieces aren't in Africa. So I don't, you see, in presenting the timeline, I mean, when I worked on this, initially I thought, well, this is kind of great, everyone gets recognition, everyone should be happy. But then at that point, and maybe you see because my purely intellectual project got hooked into the larger world history that's unfolding, then I thought, I don't know whether this is so peaceful. See, one kind of unsettling line here is even this idea of saying, well, other cultures, we recognize them, but is this something they even want? And as we know in practice, sometimes this is not things that people want, right? In other words, if recognition means, well, you can be in our museum, you see the problems with that judgment. I mean, right. They may not want to be in our museum.
I want to remember your line, you've got to have multiple aesthetics. That should be over a doorway. Anybody?
I think you bring up a multitude of interesting and things that really concern me. One way to step back for a moment is to ask about the ways in which art historians try to construct the significance of an object. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that you've given yourself over wholeheartedly to the supposition, to the art historical supposition, that the most important way to compose, or to, let's say, to draw out the significance of an object is to put it in a sequence with other objects.
Sure. That's sure.
Okay. So it seemed at a certain moment in your talk this evening that you were opposing that kind of art historical way mm-hmm. of evoking significance and what you called the aesthetic, when you mentioned connoisseurship and so on. So would it be fair to say that the aesthetic for you is an anti-historical position toward artworks? Because I would be in support of that.
Right. Let me try to answer the first part. The second one I'm less sure about. I certainly am assuming that timelines are essential because, and this goes back, let's see if you remember the Poussin example, because histories of making are what, at a certain level, art history is concerned with. That is, we want to explain how Masaccio influenced Raphael, how Raphael influenced Caravaggio, how Caravaggio influenced Constable. We want to do. Now, of course, there are lots of other things we could do, and that's an empirical question. I mean, you could say, well, could a world art history look at, let's say, religious iconography? Could it look at uses of spaces? There's this big book by David Summers now that has a very elaborate apparatus, and I mean, could it be parsed in a completely different way? There are a lot of options. To some extent, you see, the bias of my option here, subjectively, comes out of thinking of the museum. Because if you ask how is a museum organized, the natural organization generally is temporal. That is, at least in European objects, this is how we expect the structure to work. Whether there could be another structure for an art history, I mean, for a world art history, there I don't have, you see, any interesting argument in one way or another. What I like about the timelines is that to some degree, and I'm trying to do in a lecture, we can tease out an idea that it's not just Europeans, but also Chinese, Muslims, and Indians that think in these temporal terms.
But here's where I want to bring Hegel back into the argument, because Hegel subscribes to the same thing you do, but he thinks that the significance of the sequencing can really only be put into play if you say the sequencing is all over. We're at the end of it, therefore we can understand the sequencing. But, you know, for those of us who want to say, no, life continues, sequencing is a problem.
Yeah, sure. Well, there are two things about Hegel. You're right that he has this view that, you know, Arthur Dento has played so much on in the end of history, and that's certainly, you know, from Arthur's point of view, very central. But you can have a Hegelian history, that is a view that art is cultural expression, so that the Greeks express themselves and the medieval Christians express themselves, and then the Renaissance Catholics in Italy, and then the Dutch Protestants and the German Romantics of their own day. You can have that theory and go on endlessly. In other words, you can have cultural expression and say it just keeps going. It just came today from the Whitney Biennale. It's a different form of cultural expression than 20 years ago because the culture is different. But the second thing about Hegel that's kind of interesting and paradoxical is that Hegel, of course, is completely Eurocentric. And again, there is that odd quirk, the Egyptians become Europeans. So we have the Hegelian history goes from Egypt to Germany of his own day. He doesn't like the present Germans too much, but that's all Europe. But one of the things you find in the literature that's quite remarkable is that when people did histories of non-European art, they started out with Hegelian ways of thinking. And this turns out to be very interesting. I talk about in the museum book, there's an interesting 19th century Bostonian who put a lot of the collection in the museum, the Ernest Fenollosa. And what Fenollosa did is this. It's a very remarkable story. He went to Harvard. He was trained in Hegelian philosophy. That was the going thing in the kind of 1860s. That's what you learned. All across America, there were Midwestern Hegelians. There were people who wanted to run the school system in St. Louis, the elementary school system on Hegelian principles. Watered down, but basically Hegelian. So Fenollosa learns about Hegel, the advanced philosophy of the day, and then he goes off to Japan. And it's the moment of opening. Japan has just come to the West, and he buys a lot of art, and then, of course, soon that closes off. And he wants to write a history of Asian art. And he does it in Hegelian terms. Now, it goes like this, that as European art is Christian and expresses those Christian interests, so Asian art is Buddhist, and therefore it expresses those traditions. Then he has further subdivisions. The differences between Japan and China turn out to be the differences in those two cultures. So that it's... And a lot of the 20th century authors, you see, that would totally think that Hegel's ideas about, other cultures are absurd and underdeveloped. He didn't know he knew much about those things. Nevertheless, they have histories of Islamic art that are Hegelian, histories of Chinese art, histories of Indian art. The histories of Islamic art, and Grabar has a lot of those for this target, you see, they often rely on a very simple theory that gets repeated ad infinitum, but is Hegelian, which is the idea that the reason Muslims like so much decoration to fill things in is because they're desert people, and they're in this empty space, and therefore they have to fill things in. Now, this is, you see, only needs to be stated to recognize a kind of absurdity to the view, but it is interesting that in this way, Hegelian ways of thinking have turned out to be very supple. And my sense is that, you see, to get these different timelines going, one's going to have, I think those are facile theories of cultural expression. May be wrong, though, that.
There was someone over here. Yeah, there you are.
Thank you, Tom. So in your talk, when there were actual encounters, it sounded very politicized what happened. And in fact, in your response to an earlier question, there was a lot of politics.
Sure.
But when you had Matisse's response, that was fully appropriated artistic response.
Sure.
Was that a much more common thing, or is that a really unusual thing in the accounts that you have?
Okay, that's complicated. I think two things are going on. One is, you see, simply the geopolitics. And think of this in terms of the European expansion. I mean, keeping in mind that there were other cultures that had colonialism and expanded and were imperial also. When the Europeans got to the New Americas, they simply destroyed the cultures, so that the Aztecs and the Mayas are simply gone, and all we have is relics. And then it's kind of a matter of degree. When the Europeans got to India, well, eventually they colonized it completely. When they got to China, well, China was too big, too elaborate, too still strong in its own terms. And so they had a lot of influence. And you could even argue, and there's a whole literature about how Maoism, what is it? It's a kind of sinification of Marxist ideas that then, get changed in ways that would have surprised Karl Marx. So that's a very different relation. So part of the story is simply what happens in the geopolitics. And a culture had to be strong enough to survive the impact of the West in order to, for the timelines to keep going. The further question, about the art connections, see, that has to do with what I'm calling how far apart the traditions are. If you look on this line and you say, well, when the Castiglione and the other Jesuits went to China, how far apart were those lines? Well, the Chinese painted representations, and they had a concept of representation. They could recognize the European painting. On the other hand, they weren't interested in oil painting, particularly they didn't do shadows. They didn't care about perspective. One of the things, of course, is that if you're doing a scroll painting, perspective makes no sense. You're unrolling it horizontally or vertically, and the idea of that vanishing point is of no interest. So the Chinese could say, well, the European paint is interesting, but it's kind of a trick. We don't really care. They're still pretty far apart. Now, to push your point, the question is, well, what happens when the cultures get close enough that there can actually be mutual borrowing? Now, I guess a way of putting it with Matisse is that in the Renaissance, the Europeans, what use, you see, could they have made of Islamic art? The decoration, they couldn't make any use of it. But by 1900, Matisse could use it in the art, partly because, of course, European art had developed in a certain way that ideas of Islamic decoration started to make sense. Or there's a more recent case of less interest, that if you think of the pattern painters in the 70s, Kushner and a lot of others, and there was a case where Grabar's talked about this, people simply went to the Islamic world. They weren't interested in some serious way in studying Islamic art history, but they thought that the patterns were things that they could use in New York painting. So that kind of pulling over, that kind of borrowing when the lines merge, only happens when, how can I say, the lines are close enough that you see some kind of appropriation is possible. Now, that, you see, I'm distinguishing from what happens when you simply give up your tradition. That is, Castiglione, he started out in Italy as a fresco painter. And, he was an okay Baroque painter. He was trained. He was a priest. But obviously, when he went to China, he dropped that. Because in China, Christian Baroque painting made no sense. Whereas learning to paint like a Chinese painter, that was something that the Chinese could accept. Now, I should indicate the Castiglione case is interesting. Of course, this was not pure aesthetics. The Jesuits had a plan. They thought that if they got into the court and converted the emperor, then, China would become Christian. The sort of irony of that history, as I understand it, is that the Jesuits, partly they meant resistance naturally from the Chinese, but they also meant internal resistance from the church when the other missionaries said that the trouble with the Jesuits is they're watering down Christianity, they're not presenting the real doctrines, they're dressing like Chinese and so forth. So in a sense, that was a connection that failed. So the question, you see, of those merging, I think, is very tricky because it requires that the traditions seem close enough that someone can bring them together, as opposed, you see, maybe you're a Chinese, and a lot of Chinese did this in the early 20th century, and you simply abandon scroll painting and you paint like a Frenchman. But that's, in a kind of way, a less interesting case here for the theory. There's a question here or some question here? Yeah.
Yes? Patrick, here.
Well, actually, there's so many questions that can come up here, and I think I'd have to have more background to actually pinpoint what I'm trying to say. But regarding this last one, the idea that there's borrowing once there's contact with cultures or between painters,
Yeah.
so they can appropriate. It seems to me that it's not really just painters or artists that have to have this contact to be able to appropriate, but there has to actually be an underlying something to be represented in their culture for them to appropriate it, for them to have a justification for that appropriation. I don't know if you follow.
Sure.
So it's not, for example, if you have the parallel development of Judeo-Christian iconography with baby Jesus and
Sure,
Greco-Roman,
sure,
where you
sure,
have the Cupid. You have this motif of an infant child, but you have, styles that can be borrowed, but because
Sure.
each have a certain mythology that's borrowed
Sure,
from.
sure.
And also,
No, I understand that. Yeah, I think that's very interesting. I mean, here's the way I would put it, and this goes, you see, into the shape of ancient thought here, some connections, is that what things you see move between cultures? Well, alas and alack, the thing that moves fastest is military technology. That is, everyone could see that a better gun, a better cannon, faster horses, a better ship, that those things are things that get borrowed real quickly, because Muslims didn't need to accept Christian theology in order to borrow the technology. And think about this in relation to the present. I mean, look at what happened, you see, in the history of Iran, where you had the Ayatollah very clearly saying that they wanted Western tape decks. This, after all, is the whole fall of the Shah, right? They wanted that part of the technology, but they certainly weren't interested in cultural relativism nor in other political ideas, et cetera. So those things can be borrowed. Think of the Islamic translations of ancient thought. Well, a lot of the Greek philosophy came across. There are other things that, you see, weren't going to interest the Muslims. Goods, I give this example of silk. Well, for the ancients, the Romans wanted Chinese silk and spent a lot of money. They didn't have silkworms yet to get the silk. So goods like that can go back and forth because, and I mean, an obvious case would be things like gold and silver, because you don't need to know or care about another culture, you see, at that level to want to exchange. They simply have something that you can use, and you see, there's no kind of multicultural modern idea that you're interested in their beliefs. You can think they're heretics and they're doomed, and you simply think their views are absurd, but nevertheless, they're producing something that you can use, and so you can trade. Now, the history of ideas, of course, is more tricky and more complicated, because, you see, do you care about people's ideas? And when you read the histories of Islam discovering Europe and Europe discovering Islam, of course, if you think that the Quran tells the right way or the Bible tells the right way, then you wouldn't have any interest in this other culture at all. At most, it would be an interest that you want to convert them. They are mistaken, and this is one reason that Arabic was studied in Europe, that you want to go to the Islamic world and persuade them that they are wrong and tell them the truth, and you may need to deconstruct their holy book for them. I mean, that's one kind of way to go. Now, obviously, what you see goes on in these other realms of ideas, history of thought and also history of religion, you see something like this art historical process. In other words, where it's the transition of looking at another culture and saying, they're unlike us. They have different religions. They make different sorts of artifacts. They have a whole different worldview. But nevertheless, what they're doing is of interest to us, you see, in a way that has to acknowledge the difference. In other words, it would be dull to say, well, at bottom we're all monotheists. Sometimes people say, well, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, they're all one God. And you see, that's a fairly dull view because it's super obvious that the traditions are very different. So the question here, you see, of how you get to the parallel timelines of what happens when you say, well, these other cultures are interesting and they do things that are different, that are not like ours, that are not reducible to ours, but are interesting for their own sake. Now, one thought I'll just throw out here is that consider the difference between religion and art. I mean, the Met can collect all of that art because it's wonderful and use that earlier phrase I kind of lost, aesthetic, but it can all coexist because to have the Persian carpets and to have the Hindu sculpture and to have the Chinese scrolls and to have the Baroque European painting, there need be no conflict there. They all coexist in the museum. Obviously, in the religious world, things are a little more complicated, and there we look at present politics. So that in a way, you see, maybe the idea of the aesthetic is what rescues us. Now, saying that, you see, whether or not all of these cultures have something like an aesthetic, in the terms that the Western, the Fry's terms, if you will, we're familiar with, That's a hard question. I guess a facile answer would be that, you know, they make these precious objects, they devote a lot of attention to them, and they must have some kind of aesthetic going. But that's...
We've abandoned that ourselves as well, so it's almost... yeah,
at least in terms of art making of the present, yeah.
Right, so...
Sure,
so
sure. See the Whitney, you know, sure.
David, I want to say that I came here tonight with high expectations, but you've been greater than I expected.
God, thank you.
I feel like you've given us a precious gift. You opened a door just for a moment and gave us a glimpse into the future. And those of us who braved the sleet and slush and snow have received our reward. Thank you.
Thanks very much.